The first thing Elias Vance felt was pain, and it came rushing through his body like fire through dry wood. His eyes opened to a sky he did not recognize, painted in shades of purple and orange, with two suns hanging low on the horizon like the eyes of some ancient god watching him suffer. He tried to move and his legs screamed in protest. Broken somewhere below the knee, the bone grinding against itself in a way that made his stomach turn, around him lay the twisted metal remains of an escape pod. Smoke still rising from the wreckage and thin black ribbons that danced in the alien wind. Memory returned slowly, piece by piece, like a puzzle assembling itself in his mind. The Artemis 7 had been on a routine patrol mission near the Outer Rim when the Corvani raiders appeared from nowhere, their ships cutting through space like sharks through water. Captain Jareth, their Valaxian ally and commanding officer, had ordered all hands to battle stations. But it was already too late. The raiders tore through their shields like paper, and within minutes, the ship was falling apart around them. Elias remembered running to the escape pods, remembered the cold look in Jareth's S4 eyes as she made her calculation. The raiders were tracking life signs, and every pod that launched was a beacon drawing them closer. So Jareth made a choice that was logical by Valaxian standards but monstrous by human ones. She programmed Elia's pod to launch toward an uncharted planet, a death world with no name and no hope of rescue. Better to sacrifice one crew member than lead the raiders to the others. Elias remembered her voice through the intercom, calm and without feeling, telling him that his death would serve the greater good. Then the pod launched, and everything went dark until now. He pushed himself up on his elbows and looked around at the alien landscape stretching before him, violet sand covered. The ground as far as he could see, dotted with strange plants that glowed faintly in the dimming light. The air was thick and heavy, filled with tiny spores that made his lungs burn with every breath. His rebreather was damaged, cracked down one side, filtering only half of what it should. He had maybe 3 days of rations in his survival pack, a combat knife strapped to his thigh, and absolutely no way to call for help. His translator implant buzzed with static in his ear. Searching for signals, it would never find. Elias Vance was alone on a world that wanted him dead. And no one was coming to save him, but instead of despair, he felt something else rising in his chest. It was anger, hot and bright, burning away the fear and the pain until only determination remained. He had not survived 30 years in the Galactic Fleet, had not clawed his way up from the slums of old Chicago, had not fought in 3 border wars just to die on some nameless rock because a Galaxian captain decided he was expendable if this world wanted to kill him. It would have to work for it. He tore strips from his uniform and bound his broken leg as best he could, gritting his teeth against the agony. Then he fashioned a crude splint from pieces of the wrecked pod. Metal rods that groaned under his weight but held standing took everything he had. And for a moment the world spun around him in a blur of color and pain, but he stayed upright, swaying but not falling, and that small victory gave him strength. The suns were setting fast, both of them sinking below the horizon in a display of light. That would have been beautiful if he had time to appreciate it. Darkness was coming, and with it would come whatever predators called this world home. He needed shelter. Elias spotted a rock formation in the distance, dark shapes against the fading sky that promised caves and cover. He began to move, dragging his broken leg behind him, each step a battle against his own body. The violet sand shifted under his feet like it was trying to pull him down, and the glowing plants seemed to turn and watch him pass with eyeless attention. It took him an hour to reach the rocks, an hour of pain so intense that he nearly blacked out twice. But humans were stubborn creatures, built by evolution to endure what other species could not. And Elias Vance was more stubborn than most. The cave he found was deep and dark, cutting into the rock like a wound in the flesh of the planet. He dragged himself inside, his flashlight cutting a weak beam through the shadows, and collapsed against the stone wall to catch his breath. That was when he heard them. The sound came from deeper in the cave. A scraping of claws on stone that echoed off the walls like whispers in a nightmare. Then came the clicking, mandibles snapping together in a rhythm that sounded almost like communication. Elias raised his flashlight with a shaking hand and saw the eyes, dozens of them, reflecting his light back at him in pairs of burning gold, attached to bodies that emerged from the darkness, like something from a fever dream. The creatures were the size of wolves but built like insects, with 6 legs covered in sharp chitin and mouths full of teeth that could tear through metal. Their bodies were black as the void between stars, and they moved with a coordination that spoke of pack intelligence according to galactic classification. These would be Apex 9 predators, the kind that made entire colonies relocate to avoid them, and there were at least 20 of them. Surrounding him in a half circle that left no room for escape, Elias drew his combat knife, the blade catching the light of his flashlight in a gleam of desperate steel. His leg was broken, his body was failing, and he was outnumbered beyond any hope of victory. Any sane creature would have accepted death in that moment. But humans were not sane creatures. They were the species that had looked at wolves and decided to make them pets, that had seen fire and decided to hold it in their hands, that had stared at the stars and decided they would walk among them no matter the cost. Elias Vance planted his firmly as his broken leg would allow, raised his knife, and prepared to fight. The largest of the creatures stepped forward, its golden eyes fixed on him with an intelligence that seemed almost human. It was the Alpha, the leader of the pack, and it would be the first to taste his blade if it attacked. But it did not attack. Instead, it stopped just outside the reach of his knife and simply watched him, its head tilted to one side like a dog, trying to understand a new command. The others held back as well, waiting for their leader's signal, their clicking mandibles falling silent. Elias did not lower his knife, did not show an inch of weakness. But somewhere in his exhausted mind, a question formed. What were they waiting for? The Alpha's golden eyes met his, and in that moment something passed between them that neither could name. It was a recognition. Predator to predator, survivor to survivor, and for the first time since he had crashed on this alien world, Elias Vance allowed himself to hope. The standoff lasted through the night, and into the pale light of morning. Elias did not sleep, did not lower his knife, did not allow his body to show the weakness that screamed through every fiber of his being. The creatures watched him with those golden eyes that seemed to glow, even without light, their bodies still as statues carved from living darkness. His leg throbbed with a pain that had become almost familiar, a constant companion that reminded him he was still alive. The Alpha remained at the front of the pack, never moving more than a few feet from where it had first stopped, its attention fixed on Elias like he was the most interesting thing it had ever seen. Several times during the night, younger members of the pack grew restless, their mandibles clicking in what Elias assumed was frustration or hunger. One of them, smaller than the others but no less deadly, finally lost patience and lunged forward with teeth bared and claws extended. Elias did not flinch. He did not step back or cry out or show any sign of the fear that pounded through his veins like ice water. Instead, he did something that came from a place deeper than thought, a place where millions of years of evolution had written instructions in the very code of his DNA. He roared. The sound that came from his throat was not quite human, raw and primal and full of a fury that surprised even him. At the same moment, he slammed his knife into the dirt at his feet with enough force to send up a spray of stone, a challenge written in violence that needed no translation. The young creature froze mid-leap, its golden eyes wide with something that looked almost like shock. The rest of the pack went completely still, their clicking silenced, Their bodies tense with sudden uncertainty, and the Alpha moved. It crossed the distance between them in 3 swift strides. So fast that Elias barely had time to pull his knife from the ground before the creature was upon him. But instead of attacking, it did something that Elias would remember for the rest of his life. The Alpha lowered its great head until its mandibles nearly touched the cave floor. Its body pressed flat against the stone in a posture of complete submission. One by one, the others followed 20 alien predators, each one capable of tearing him apart in seconds. Bowed before a broken human with nothing but a knife and a refusal to die, Elias stood there in the dim light of the cave, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his teeth, and try to understand what had just happened. The answer would come to him slowly over the following days, pieced together from observation and desperate experimentation. These creatures, which he came to call the scry after the clicking sound they made when communicating, operated on instincts that most galactic species had evolved past millions of years ago. They lived by the old way, the way of the pack, where strength and dominance determined everything from leadership to survival. The scry communicated through a complex system of pheromones and bioelectric fields, reading the chemical and electrical signatures of everything around them, and Elias, with his damaged translator implant still buzzing uselessly in his ear, was broadcasting something they had never encountered before. The human heart, when pushed to its absolute limit, produced an electromagnetic pulse unlike anything else in the known galaxy. It was the signature of a creature that had stared into the void and refused to blink, that had faced death and chosen to fight rather than surrender to the scry. That signal read as pure dominance, as alpha in the truest sense of the word in galactic society. Most intelligent species were embarrassed by their evolutionary past, treating pack dynamics and dominance displays as primitive behaviors best forgotten. They had evolved past such things, become civilized, learned to resolve conflicts through negotiation, and reason. Humans had done that too, on the surface at least, but deep in their limbic systems, buried beneath layers of culture and technology, humans still carried the wolf. They still remembered what it meant to stand their ground when every instinct screamed to run, to challenge when challenge meant death, to lead when leadership required sacrifice. The scry recognized that ancient truth in Elias, saw in him something their species had been waiting for without even knowing they were waiting. They saw an alpha worthy of following. The days that followed were the hardest of Elias's life, but also the most transformative. His leg healed slowly, set by his own hands in an operation that required him to bite down on a strip of leather to keep from screaming. The scry brought him food, carcasses of smaller creatures that he cooked over fires built from the strange wood of the glowing plants. He learned to read their body language, the subtle shifts in posture and the patterns of their clicking that conveyed emotion and intent. They learned to read him as well, following his pointing fingers and responding to the tone of his voice, even when his words meant nothing to them. The alpha, whom Elias named Razor for the sharpness of its mandibles, became his closest companion. It slept at the entrance to his cave, guarding him through the night, and walked beside him when he finally began to venture outside through Razor. Elias learned about this world he'd been abandoned on. He learned about the great worms that tunneled beneath the violet sand, creatures so large that their passing caused the ground to shake like an earthquake. He learned about the spore storms that swept across the plains, clouds of toxic particles that could strip flesh from bone in minutes. He learned about the other packs of scry that roamed the territory, rivals who would kill without hesitation to claim new hunting grounds, and slowly, he began to teach them what he knew in return. Human warfare was not a matter of strength alone, but of strategy, of coordination, of using the environment as a weapon. He showed Razor how to set ambushes, how to use the terrain to funnel prey into kill zones, how to attack from multiple directions at once to overwhelm larger opponents. The scry were natural hunters, But under Elias's guidance, they became something more. They became soldiers. Word spread through the ecosystem in ways Elias could not fully understand. Carried on pheromone trails and bioelectric whispers that passed from creature to creature across hundreds of miles. Other packs began to appear at the edges of his territory. Not to challenge, but to observe. They watched the way Razor's pack hunted, saw the impossible kills they achieved against creatures that should have been their superiors, and they wanted to know how one by one. The alphas of these packs came to the cave where Elias had made his home, and one by one, they bowed within 3 months. Elias Vance had gone from a castaway waiting to die to the leader of the largest Scry alliance this planet had ever seen. He had become something that should not have been possible. A human ruling over alien predators through nothing but will and wisdom. He had become the Beast King, but his trials were only beginning. For the stars had not forgotten about this small world, and forces far more dangerous than the Scry were about to take notice. 6 months had passed since Elias Vance fell from the sky, and in that time he had become something that legends are made of. He walked across the violet sands with the confidence of a man who had conquered death itself, his body wrapped in armor, fashioned from scry chitin that gleamed like black glass in the light of the twin suns. The broken leg that had nearly killed him was now strong again. Muscled from months of hunting and fighting alongside his pack, his hair had grown long and wild, tied back with strips of leather, and his face bore the scars of battles that would have ended any other castaway. But it was his eyes that had changed the most. Those blue human eyes that now held a fire that made even the largest scry lower their gaze in respect. Behind him walked Razor, the Alpha, who had been the first to bow, now his most trusted companion and the enforcer of his will. Behind Razor came the others, hundreds of scry from dozens of packs, a living river of black chitin and golden eyes that stretched back toward the horizon. They had come from every corner of this nameless world, drawn by stories of the strange soft creature who fought like a demon and thought like a god. The predators that refused to join his alliance learned quickly what it meant to stand against the Beast King. Elias had mapped much of this world in his months of wandering, learning its secrets and its dangers. He knew where the great worms slept beneath the sand and which tunnels led to underground rivers of fresh water. He knew when the spore storms would come and where to find shelter when they did. He knew the patterns of the seasons, such as they were on a world with twin suns, and how the creatures of this place adapted to survive them. But more than knowledge, he had brought something to the scry that they had never possessed before. He had brought purpose. The packs had always fought among themselves. Endless territorial wars that kept their numbers low and their potential wasted. Elias ended those wars not through force alone, but through organization, dividing the land into territories that each pack could claim without conflict. He established hunting grounds that rotated with the seasons, ensuring that no area was stripped bare of prey. He created a system of communication between packs, using runners and signal fires and the bioelectric network that the scry naturally possessed. For the first time in their evolutionary history, the scry were not just predators, but a civilization. It was crude by galactic standards, primitive in ways that would have made most intelligent species laugh, but it was also effective. And it was growing stronger every day. Elias often sat alone on the ridge above his cave in the evenings, watching the twin suns set while Razor dozed at his feet. In those quiet moments, he thought about Earth, about the family he had left behind when he joined the fleet, about the friends who probably believed him dead. He wondered if anyone had mourned for him, if his name had been added to the memorial wall at fleet headquarters, if Captain Jareth had felt even a moment of guilt for abandoning him. But those thoughts always faded, replaced by the reality of the world around him and the creatures who depended on him. He had built something here, something real and alive and worth protecting, and he would protect it with everything he had. The ship appeared on the morning of his 200th day on the planet. Descending from the sky like a metal bird of prey, Elias spotted it from miles away. The glint of sunlight on hull plating impossible to miss against the purple sky. He felt his heart lurch in his chest, a mix of hope and fear that he had not experienced since his first night in the cave. Was it rescue? Finally come to take him home, or was it something else entirely? The answer became clear when the ship landed on the plains below his ridge and its markings became visible. Kovanni, the same species that had attacked the Artemis 7, the same raiders whose assault had led to his abandonment, but this was not a war vessel. Not one of the sleek, deadly ships that had torn through his fleet like wolves through sheep. This was a slaver ship, broad and ugly, designed for one purpose. And one purpose only: harvesting. The Kovanni were known throughout the galaxy as collectors, gatherers of rare specimens from uncivilized worlds. They would descend on planets like this one, capture the most interesting creatures they could find, and sell them to zoos and research facilities and private collectors across 100 systems. The Scry, with their unique biology and their fearsome appearance, would fetch a premium price on the black market. Elias watched through the scope he had salvaged from his escape pod as the Kovanni began to set up their operation. There were perhaps 50 of them, gray-skinned bipeds with faces that looked like they had been carved from stone by an angry sculptor. They moved with the arrogance of creatures who had never faced real resistance, setting up containment fields and preparing their capture equipment with casual efficiency. Their leader was easy to spot. A massive specimen with scars running down one side of his face and a commanding voice that carried even to Elias's distant position. The Kovanni commander surveyed the landscape with the satisfied expression of a butcher examining a fresh delivery of meat. He had no idea what was watching him from the ridgeline above. Elias turned to Razor, who had risen to stand beside him, golden eyes fixed on the aliens below with unmistakable hunger. The Scry knew what the Kovanni were, even without understanding their technology. They could smell the intent, could read the bioelectric signatures of creatures who viewed everything around them as property to be claimed. Razor's mandibles clicked rapidly, a question that Elias had learned to interpret over months of communication. What do we do? Elias looked at the slaver ship, at the armed Kovanni spreading across his territory like a disease, at the containment fields being erected to cage the preys, creatures who had saved his life. Then he looked at the army waiting behind him. Hundreds of the deadliest predators this world had ever produced, trained by human tactics and united by human leadership. The Kovanni had come here expecting easy prey, specimens too primitive to fight back. They had no idea that this world already had a king. Elias smiled. And it was not a pleasant expression. It was the smile of a man who had been abandoned and betrayed, who had fought through hell and built an empire from nothing, who had every reason in the universe to hate the galaxy that had thrown him away. It was the smile of a predator about to teach other predators the meaning of fear. He turned to Razor and gave the signal, a gesture they had developed together over countless hunts. The message was simple and needed no translation. Tonight, we hunt. Commander the Xul of the Kovanni Harvester fleet had conquered 17 worlds in his career and captured specimens that sold for more credits than most species earned in a lifetime. He was feared throughout the Outer Rim, respected by his peers, and absolutely certain that this nameless death world would be just another easy harvest. The creatures his scouts had identified were perfect merchandise, insectoid predators with exotic biology that collectors would pay fortunes to own. His crew of 50 was more than enough for a simple capture operation, and they would be off-world within a week with holds full of valuable cargo. That was the plan. At least, before everything went wrong. The first squad vanished on the second night. 12 experienced hunters who walked into the tunnel network to search for specimens and never walked out. The Xul sent search parties, but they found nothing. Not bodies, not equipment, not even blood. It was as if the planet itself had swallowed his people whole. The second squad fared no better. Though they survived longer, they made camp on the western edge of the landing zone, setting up sensor perimeters and sleeping in shifts as protocol demanded. When the sun rose the next morning, their equipment had been destroyed. Power cells drained and weapons rendered useless by some force they could not identify. The soldiers themselves were unharmed but shaken, reporting sounds in the night, movement just beyond their vision. The sense of being watched by countless eyes. Vexhul was not a creature prone to fear, but even he began to feel something cold settling in his stomach. This world was fighting back in ways that defied everything he knew about primitive ecosystems. By the fourth night, his remaining crew had barricaded themselves inside the ship, jumping at every sound and refusing to venture outside after dark. They reported impacts against the hull, heavy bodies testing the metal for weaknesses, claws scraping against reinforced plating in patterns that almost sounded deliberate. The sensors showed nothing, or rather they showed too much. Hundreds of life signs moving through the darkness in formations that no animal should be capable of maintaining. It was impossible. Vexhul told himself as he paced the bridge of his ship. Animals did not strategize, did not coordinate, did not wage psychological warfare against superior opponents. There had to be an explanation. Some natural phenomenon he was not aware of. Some quirk of this planet's ecology that made it seem like the creatures were intelligent. Then the message came. It arrived through his communication array. A voice speaking in accented but perfect galactic standard, cutting through the static like a blade through flesh. This world is claimed, and its people are under my protection. So take your ship and your slavers and leave while you still can. Vexhul stared at the speakers as if they had betrayed him. His stone-carved face twisted in disbelief. "Who is this?" he demanded, though he already knew the answer in some deep part of his mind. "I am the one who has been hunting you," the voice replied, calm and cold and utterly without fear. "I am the one who took your squads and destroyed your equipment and kept you awake with terror for 4 nights. And I am giving you one chance to survive, which is more than your kind gave my ship when you attacked us in the Outer Rim." The communication cut off, leaving Vexhul in silence, a human somehow. Impossibly, there was a human on this world, and that human had turned the native creatures into an army. Vexhul knew about humans. Of course, as everyone in the galaxy knew about humans. They were a young species, barely out of their own solar system in the grand scale of things. But they had already earned a reputation that made older races nervous. Humans were adaptable in ways that defied logic, capable of surviving environments that killed everything else, forming bonds with creatures that should have eaten them, and turning hopeless situations into victories through sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The smart move would be to leave, to cut his losses and find easier prey elsewhere. But Vexhul had not become a commander by being smart. He had become a commander by being ruthless. "All hands to combat stations," he ordered, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. "We are going hunting." The battle began at dawn. When the Corvani emerged from their ship in full combat armor with energy weapons charged and ready, Vexhul had decided that overwhelming force was the only answer. A single decisive strike that would kill whatever creature dared to threaten him and scatter the rest. He positioned his soldiers in a defensive formation. Back to the ship, weapons pointed outward, sensors scanning for any sign of movement for a long moment. Nothing happened. The violet sands stretched empty in every direction, the twin suns casting long shadows across the plain. The only sound the whisper of wind through the distant rock formations. Then the ground exploded. The scry burst from tunnels that the Corvani sensors had not detected, emerging in perfect coordination to strike from beneath and behind and every angle at once. They moved like liquid shadow, faster than anything their size had a right to be. Their chitin armor deflecting energy blasts that should have dropped them instantly. The Corvani formation collapsed in seconds. Soldiers dragged screaming into the tunnels, weapons torn from hands. Armor peeled away by mandibles that had learned exactly where to strike. Dexul fired wildly into the chaos, hitting nothing but sand and air, his carefully planned operation dissolving into pure nightmare around him and through it all. Standing on a ridge overlooking the carnage, a figure watched. The human was dressed in black armor that gleamed in the sunlight. A crown of scry chitin sitting on his head like something from an ancient legend. Beside him stood the largest scry Dexul had ever seen, its golden eyes fixed on the battlefield with obvious satisfaction. The human raised one hand, and the attack stopped. The scry withdrew as quickly as they had appeared, vanishing into their tunnels and leaving the surviving Corvani standing in the ruins of their operation. Of the 50 soldiers Dexul had brought to this world, perhaps 15 remained, and they were surrounded. Elias Vance walked down from the ridge with the calm stride of a king approaching his throne. The massive scry at his side like a faithful hound. He stopped 10 feet from Dexul, close enough that the Corvani commander could see the scars on his face and the cold fire burning in his eyes. "I gave you a chance to leave," Elias said, his voice carrying across the silent battlefield. "You should have taken it, but your kind never does. So now you have a choice. Surrender your ship and your weapons and walk to the nearest settlement where you can call for pickup. Or stay here and become food for my people." Dexul looked at the creatures surrounding him, at the bodies of his soldiers scattered across the sand, at the human who had somehow become more terrifying than any predator he had ever faced. He dropped his weapon. The others followed. Elias watched them go. A column of defeated slavers, trudging across the violet sand toward a distant horizon, stripped of everything but their lives. Then he turned to look at his new ship, the Corvani harvester that would become his voice to the stars. The galaxy had abandoned him on this world, had left him for dead on a rock that should have been his grave. Now he was going to send a message that would make them remember his name. He climbed into the ship with Razor at his side and activated the communication array, broadcasting on every frequency he could reach. "This is Commander Elias Vance of the Terran Fleet, formerly of the Artemis 7, and I am claiming this world in the name of its people. The scry are under my protection, and anyone who comes here with intent to harm them will face the same fate as the Corvani slavers who tried before you. So bring your hunters, bring your raiders, bring your armies. The pack will be waiting." The message went out into the void, carried by subspace transmitters to 1,000 different receivers across the outer rim and in Galactic Fleet headquarters, in Corvani command centers, in 100 different places where powerful beings made decisions that shaped the fate of worlds. People began to pay attention. The Beast King had announced himself to the galaxy. Nothing would ever be the same. The Galactic Union patrol ship descended through the atmosphere of the unnamed world 6 months after the Beast King's message had first echoed across the stars. Inside, a delegation of diplomats and military observers sat in uncomfortable silence, none of them quite sure what to expect from the being who had become the most talked-about figure in the Outer Rim. The reports seemed impossible. A single human, abandoned on a death world, somehow uniting the native predators into a functioning society. Most officials believed it was a hoax, an elaborate trick designed to keep slavers and raiders away from a planet that probably held nothing of value. But the Corvani survivors had told a different story. Their stone faces pale with a fear that could not be faked. They spoke of a human who moved through the darkness like a ghost, who commanded monsters with a gesture, who had turned their hunting expedition into a nightmare they would never forget. So the Union had sent its patrol ship to investigate, to determine if the Beast King was real and what threat or opportunity he might represent. Among the delegation was a Valaxian diplomat named Syra. Her 4 eyes scanning the data on her tablet as the ship descended. She knew things about this situation that the others did not. Secrets that made her heart beat faster with every passing minute. She had served on the Artemis 7 under Captain Jareth. Had been there when the decision was made to abandon Commander Vance to this world. The official report claimed he had died in the escape pod launch. A tragic casualty of the Corvani attack, but Syra had always wondered. Had always felt a weight in her chest when she thought about the human they had left behind. Now she was about to find out if that weight was guilt for a murder or the beginning of something far more complicated. The ship landed on a flat stretch of violet sand, and the delegation emerged to find themselves in the middle of a gathering that took their breath away. Thousands of scry covered the landscape in every direction, their black chitin gleaming in the light of the twin suns. Their golden eyes fixed on the new arrivals with an intensity that made even the armed guards nervous. They stood in formations, organized groups that radiated outward from a central point, like the petals of some massive, deadly flower, and at the center of it all, seated on a throne carved from the skull of a great worm, sat Elias Vance. He looked nothing like the fleet officer Syra remembered. That clean-cut professional who had followed orders and kept his opinions to himself. This man was a warrior king from some ancient human legend, dressed in armor of scry chitin that seemed to drink the light. A crown of the same material resting on his wild hair. His face bore scars that told stories of battles she could not imagine. And his eyes held a depth that made her feel like a child standing before something vast and unknowable. Beside him sat the largest scry any of them had ever seen. A massive creature whose golden eyes tracked every movement of the delegation with obvious intelligence. Elias rose as they approached, and the assembled scry rose with him, thousands of predators standing in unison like soldiers saluting their general. "Welcome to Screeth," Elias said, his voice carrying across the silent plain. "That is the name I have given this world. Home of the scry, and I am its king." The lead diplomat, a nervous Thalaxian bureaucrat who had drawn the short straw for this assignment, stepped forward with practiced composure. "Commander Vance, the Galactic Union is pleased to find you alive and well, and we have many questions about the situation here, as well as potential offers for your return to civilized space." Elias smiled, and it was not a warm expression. "I am not returning anywhere, and you can tell the Union that this world and its people are now under my protection, which means any species that wishes to interact with us will do so on our terms." He gestured to the scry around him, the vast army of predators who watched the diplomats like wolves watching sheep. The scry are not specimens to be collected, or primitives to be conquered, as they are a people with their own culture and their own rights. And I have spent the last year helping them build the foundations of a civilization that will one day take its place among the stars. Syra stepped forward, her 4 eyes meeting the humans too, and spoke the words she had been holding inside since the day she learned he was alive. "Commander Vance, I was there when Captain Jareth gave the order to abandon you, and I want you to know that I protested, that I tried to stop her, that I have carried the guilt of your supposed death every day since." Elias studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I know," he said finally. "I found the ship's logs in the Corvani database after I took their vessel, so I know who argued against my abandonment and who stayed silent and who actively supported the decision." He turned to address the full delegation, his voice carrying the weight of authority that only true leaders possess. The Valaxian government believed that sacrificing one human life was an acceptable trade for the safety of their ship. And perhaps by their cold mathematics it was. That they made a mistake that every species that has ever underestimated humanity has made. He stepped down from his throne, walking among the diplomats who shrank back from his presence. They assumed that abandoning me would end the problem, that I would die quietly on this rock and never trouble them again. But humans do not die quietly, as we do not accept the roles that others assign us. And we do not forgive those who treat us as expendable. He stopped in front of Syra, and for a moment his expression softened, but we also remember those who stood for us when standing was dangerous. And you showed courage that day, Diplomat Syra, the kind of courage that the scry respect. So you have nothing to fear from me. Behind him, Razor rose to his full height and released a sound that the diplomat's translators struggled to interpret before finally resolving into words that made them gasp. Long live the Beast King! The cry was taken up by the assembled scry, thousands of voices joining in a chorus that shook the very ground beneath their feet. Long live the Beast King! Elias turned back to his throne, to the kingdom he had built from nothing, to the future he had carved out of a world that was meant to be his grave. Go back to the Union, he said over his shoulder. Tell them that Screeth is open to trade and diplomacy with any species that comes in peace. And tell them that we will defend ourselves against any who come with war. But most importantly, tell them this. He sat on his throne of bone and chitin, the Beast King in his full glory, surrounded by an army of creatures who had once been his death sentence and were now his greatest strength. Tell them that you can strand us on the darkest rocks in the coldest void, that you can betray us and abandon us and leave us for dead in places that should be impossible to survive. And we will rise, we will adapt, and we will build. And when you return expecting to find our bones, we will be waiting with an empire. He smiled then, the same smile he had worn in that first cave surrounded by predators, the smile of a human who had looked death in the face and laughed. Tell them that is what it means to be human. And tell them that the galaxy had better get used to it, because we are just getting started. The delegation left that day with a new member world for the Galactic Union and a story that would spread across 1,000 systems. They spoke of the Beast King in voices filled with wonder and fear, of the human who had done the impossible and the creatures who called him father. And somewhere in the reaches of space, other humans heard those stories and felt something stir in their hearts. The ancient call of their species that whispered of challenges to overcome and worlds to conquer. The galaxy had tried to break Elias Vance, and instead he had become something that would inspire generations to come. He had become proof that humanity would never stop fighting, never stop building, never stop reaching for the stars no matter what stood in their way. He had become legend, and legends never die.